Well, I got a comment this week that made me realize I've been committing what I consider to be one of the cardinal sins of a doctor, which is using medical jargon without describing it. And the comment said, "What is functional illness?" So that's what I'm going to address in this video, because functional illness is an important topic in disability medicine. And to put it simply, a functional illness is an illness that's imaginary, that isn't real. That doesn't necessarily mean that the person who claims to have it is acting or faking, although a minority of such people are acting or faking. The majority, in my opinion, aren't. They're claiming to have these imaginary illnesses because they're psychologically unwell. Hello, I'm John Foster. I'm a medical doctor who does Social Security disability exams, and as usual, everything I say reflects my own opinions based on my own experience and study, and not the opinions of the Social Security Administration or any other medical body. Now, in this video, I'm going to describe the various types of functional illness, and I'm going to give an example of people that I've seen with each type. And if you find this sort of topic interesting, you might want to subscribe to my channel. I generally put out one disability-related video every Friday morning. Now, there are two types of conscious acting or deliberately attempting to mislead the doctor. Two types of functional illness. The first is called malingering. This is where the patient consciously decides to try to deceive the doctor for what we call secondary gain. And common examples of secondary gain are money, addictive drugs, avoiding work, avoiding military service, or avoiding prison. An example that I've given before, I had some free time during a day of disability exams, and I was watching the parking lot, and I saw a man get out of a truck with no shirt on, and then he put on a t-shirt, raising his arms high above his head without any difficulty. When I went to examine him, I asked him to raise his arms above his head, as I do for all patients to determine their range of motion, and he lifted his arms up shoulder height and said he couldn't lift them any higher because he had chronic shoulder pain. What was an obvious lie in an attempt to deceive me so he could get disability payments. This type of person is generally unwilling to undergo painful medical tests or procedures, such as surgery. The second type of consciously deceiving patient is what we call factitious illness. This is where the patient consciously tries to deceive the physician or to appear ill, but not for easy to understand motivations, such as money or drugs. They seem to be doing it because they crave the attention and sympathy they get for being sick. And these type of people are willing to undergo painful or difficult tests or procedures, many of them even having many operations, because that gives them more attention and sympathy. An example of a patient that I saw, I worked in an emergency department where all of the emergency room doctors were familiar with a young man who would come in frequently quite sick with a very low salt level in his blood. And the reason why was because he would drink tremendous amounts of water to make himself sick so that he would wind up admitted to the hospital. And sure enough, he had to be admitted over and over again to correct the dangerously low levels of salt in his blood. Tragically, one day he miscalculated and drank so much water that it could not be corrected, and he died of what's called water intoxication. Now, the other types of functional illness appear to be involuntary or unconscious. The patient is acting sick, but not deliberately. It's their unconscious motivations that are causing them to act sick. And since we can't read people's minds, we can never fully understand why these people do what they do. There's a theory, unproven, that these people are very unhappy and that they see being sick as a way to get out of their unhappiness and deal with the stresses of their life. The first type is conversion hysteria. This is rarely seen in disability medicine because this is usually a short-term process. The person is put in an unbearable situation that they simply cannot cope with. And to deal with that, they suddenly and abruptly become disabled, commonly with a neurological, brain and nervous system problem. Here's an example that I saw early on in my emergency medicine career. A 16-year-old girl was brought in a coma. The story from her parents was her boyfriend had broken up with her that day and she'd taken an overdose of drugs. When I examined her, she was completely unresponsive. I shouted in her ear, no response. I applied a painful stimulus, no response at all. So, in that situation, the proper thing to do is to intubate the patient, to pass a plastic tube down their throat, through their voice box, into their lungs. And I went to do that. It's a very unpleasant procedure if the person is awake, and it's usually only done if the person's sedated or unconscious. As soon as I went to pass the tube, the young woman sat up and started crying hysterically. It was clear that the entire time she'd been conscious. And after crying and some settling down and sympathy, she walked out of the emergency department with her parents. That's an example of this short-lived phenomenon. The next type of functional illness tends to be long-term, and that's called hypochondriasis, also known as somatic symptom disorder. In this case, the people seem to make a lifestyle out of complaining of all sorts of physical problems and illnesses, which generally involve multiple body symptoms, very often with pain and a lot of vague, unprovable symptoms, such as headache, back pain, indigestion, dizziness. An example would be a woman that I saw who had an endless list of medical diagnoses and complaints that she believed that she had. And I'd already gone through her old medical records, and no doctor who'd seen her in the past had been able to find any serious physical illness. And I examined her from head to toe, and I couldn't find any signs of illness whatsoever. And in the entire half hour I was with her, she never stopped bringing up more and more things that she believed were wrong with her. These type of people are eager to have medical tests and often procedures and operations done. and they seem to me to be very full of negative emotion. They're overwhelmed with anxiety and depression. Another type of functional illness is delusional disorder. These people tend towards psychosis. They're out of touch with reality. The being out of touch may be limited to one thing, or it may be inclusive of many things in their life. Here's some examples. I've mentioned in the past that I saw a woman in her 60s who would come to the clinic every couple of months believing that she was pregnant and wanting a pregnancy test, even though it was obviously impossible for her to be pregnant in her 60s. Somewhat related illnesses are anorexia nervosa, where generally young women who are thin believe that they're monstrously obese and starve themselves in an attempt to get thinner, sometimes even to the point of death. And a newer disorder called bigorexia, where young men become obsessed with bodybuilding and are in terror that they might be losing their muscles. I've seen one such patient, a man who was a devoted bodybuilder, who was in a relatively minor automobile accident, but it temporarily limited his ability to lift weights. And he was just overwhelmed with anxiety that he might be losing some of his muscle mass. The final type of functional illness that I'm going to discuss is sort of on the borderline between mental illness and functional illness, and that's illness anxiety disorder. These are people who are overwhelmed with constant anxiety that something is seriously wrong with them. They often see many, many doctors and have many tests. And no matter how many doctors they have and how many tests they have that come back normal, no one can reassure them that they're healthy. When I was training in medicine, I had the great honor of being trained by a Dr. Nigel Champion. He was a senior resident in the medical service where I was an intern. A wonderful guy and highly intelligent, and he became a gastroenterologist, a stomach and digestive system specialist. And a couple of years after my training, I read a letter from him in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. He had seen a woman who was absolutely convinced that there was something seriously wrong with her digestive system and that it could be figured out by looking at her bowel movements. So she put her most memorable bowel movements in a white colander, photographed them, and went from gastroenterologist to gastroenterologist showing them this album of photos. And she managed to see every single gastroenterologist in the country of Canada, none of whom could find anything wrong with her. So that's what functional illness is. It's imaginary illness that may be brought forth consciously by the patient, but in many cases, in the majority of cases, is brought forth unconsciously by the patient. Well, I hope this has been helpful, and as always, remember, if it happens, it's possible.